He's the UFC middleweight champion of the world, one of the finest strikers to have ever graced the octagon. In a true crossover sensation with a fan base that is growing by the year, how much of the last Stylebender's truly interesting backstory do you actually know? Here are 10 things you didn't know about Israel Adesanya. Number 10. His roots. Israel Adesanya is a man who is quite proud of his Nigerian roots, having spent several of his earliest years in his home city of Lagos. Born on Nigerian soil to an accountant father and a mother who was a nurse, he was the eldest of 5 children and likely the best at fighting too, if we had to guess. He had a relatively comfortable upbringing economically due to the status of his parents, and at the age of 9, his family relocated to Ghana for 10 months before eventually leaving the continent entirely to make a fresh start in Rotorua, New Zealand. Israel's parents made this move due to their desire to see their children receive a high level of education, to earn qualifications in schools that were well recognized on a global level. And though the transition was initially difficult for this future combat sport superstar, he would later find his path as he moved into his formative years, but we'll get into that later. Number 9. Other interests. One of Izzy's main passions outside of the martial arts comes in the form of his abilities as a dancer. Inside the cage and ring, Adesanya's distinctive style of movement comes as a result of his years of training and competitive years as a professional dancer. Yes, this future middleweight champion was once just as determined to win dance competitions as he was to earn knockouts in a fight, and this passion was showcased during the iconic walkout he brought us for his UFC 243 showdown against the then-champion Robert Whittaker, a choreographed piece he did alongside his old dancing troupe from his earliest days in New Zealand. On top of this, anyone who instantly recognized this influence behind his name, the last Stylebender, will immediately be able to point out that Adesanya is a fan of anime. But even to this day, the fearsome striker remains a huge fan of anime cartoons, especially but not limited to Death Note, Naruto, and of course Avatar: The Last Stylebender. He also has a tattoo of one of the show's main characters, Toph Beifong, on his forearm. Talk about dedication to your passions, eh? Well, if there's one thing that has defined Izzy's career over the years, it's his unwillingness to forget what made him the man he is today. Whether it's shouting out his Nigerian heritage or paying homage to cartoons that had tremendous impact, Israel Adesanya is well and truly a sum of his parts. Number 8. An alternative route. It's hard to envision what life would have been like for most of these elite fighters if things had played out in a slightly different fashion. However, in the case of Israel Adesanya, if success hadn't hit him so dramatically as he discovered kickboxing, he could well have followed through on a degree in computer science. Yes, that's right. After early Taekwondo exposure and a dip into kickboxing in early manhood, Izzy enrolled in a Bachelor of Science in Computer Design at the Universal College of Learning in Wangunwe after completing his high school education. Indeed, if he had remained focused on his education, MMA would have been deprived of one of its most electric talents. Thankfully, after a few years spent making clear improvements to his kickboxing, Adesanya decided to put all of his eggs into one basket and focus entirely on working on his striking. It's pretty safe to say that it worked out pretty well, right? Number 7. A tough start. Every fighter has a different reason for diving headfirst into what they do. And for Israel, though he was influenced to begin training kickboxing due to the Muay Thai film Ong Bak, one of the major contributing factors that saw him seek out martial arts was persistent bullying he was subjected to in high school. I know it's difficult to imagine anyone picking on the 6'4", 185-pound king, but once upon a time, the last Stylebender was not the man he is today. Thankfully, this turned out to be a blessing in disguise, leading this future world champion down a path that would change his life forever. They say pressure forges diamonds, and while that is true for a majority of fighters who took influence from their hardships, few have managed to carve out a level of success to the extent that Israel Adesanya has. Number 6. A dip into boxing. We all know about Adesanya's kickboxing pedigree that would later follow, but what most people don't realize is that Stylebender actually carved out a pretty impressive early career stint in the boxing ring. He went 5-1 as a pro before leaving the sport behind him. What's truly interesting here is that his professional debut came in a cruiserweight boxing tournament that saw him make his first walk to the ring against the future Australian cruiserweight champion, Daniel Aman. What was even more impressive was the fact that while the fight went in Aman's favor by unanimous decision, the result was actually quite controversial, and many people believe that Izzy had done more than enough to take home the victory. Talk about an early feather in your cap. A lot of boxers would generally take an easy road through their first 5 or 10 professional matchups, but given his confidence and his striking abilities, Israel well and truly was thrown into the deep end, and on a different day, he could well have taken home the victory. Remember, if you're enjoying our content and want to see more, be sure to leave a like before subscribing to the channel so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Number 5. Elite Kickboxer. But boxing success was not the only thing that defined Adesanya's pre-UFC run. Indeed, everyone knows that he came from kickboxing to MMA, but what many might not know is just how successful he was in the ring, and how daring he was with his matchmaking. With a pro record of 75 wins and 5 losses, Adesanya competed everywhere from middleweight up to heavyweight in the squared circle, finding a huge level of success that saw him ranked in the top 10 under the Glory banner before hitting a 2-fight skid in form prior to leaving the sport. Only one fighter has managed to finish Izzy so far in his career, and we'll get to that shortly. But even among his 4 other losses in kickboxing, some of those were not overly clear-cut, with many believing that Stylebender had actually won his second-to-last bout in the sport against Jason Wilness, who took home the unanimous decision victory. To put it simply, Adesanya's road to the octagon has been one filled to the brim with success in combat sports. Number 4. A kickboxing setback. As we mentioned before, Israel's time in kickboxing is in many ways unfairly remembered by a shocking KO defeat at the hands of Alex Pereira. What a lot of you won't know is that Izzy was winning the fight prior to getting his light shut out. However, this loss, despite it being incredibly brutal, has aged particularly well due to the fact that Pereira went on to become the world's greatest middleweight boxer, eventually rising to number 6 on the pound-for-pound rankings. As the owner of one of the greatest left hooks in all of combat sports, you'd be hard-pressed to find a cleaner connection than the one he landed on Stylebender. What's even more interesting is that Pereira himself has since made the move over to MMA, winning his UFC debut with a stunning flying knee knockout at UFC 268. And though he made the switch a lot later in his career than Adesanya did, if he can find a consistent run of form, who knows? Perhaps the UFC middleweight division will play host to a third matchup between these 2 old kickboxing rivals. That would certainly be one hell of a spectacle. Number 3. A slow transition. Upon deciding that a switch to mixed martial arts was on the cards, Izzy needed a gym full of people who had the talents necessary to guide him in the right direction. And sure enough, though it wasn't the MMA powerhouse that is today, City Kickboxing proved to be the perfect home for this future elite. Eugene Behrman is today cited by many to be among the greatest coaches and overall minds in MMA. But at the time, the gyms weren't what they were today. But upon moving to Auckland, New Zealand, Adesanya attempted to make the transition correctly, beginning his MMA training at the age of 21, debuting in 2012, before slowly moving away from kickboxing after fighting in MMA just 3 times between the ages of 21 and 24, before upping his schedule tremendously after that point. At that stage in his career, he called the likes of Dan Hooker, Kai Kara-France, and Alexander Volkanovski his gym mates, and from there on, this slowly blossoming gym began to make some serious waves in the fight game. Number 2. Trailblazer. This might come as a surprise to some of you, but Israel Adesanya holds the distinction of being the very first MMA fighter to have ever signed a sponsorship deal with Puma. When you consider just how much of a staple Puma has been to the sporting world, it's pretty crazy to think that it took them this long to get involved directly with MMA's vast pool of talent. But sure enough, Izzy was the one who stood out above all others, bringing his unique flair and appeal to the veteran brand in September of 2020. Adesanya is, of course, a highly marketable figure, with everything from his look to his fighting style proving to be a major selling point. So it's pretty safe to say that Puma did a good job at getting a signature on paper, eh? Number 1. Early signs? Those who tuned in to watch Israel Adesanya in his earliest days will have clearly seen his potential as a future contender within the middleweight division. However, what many people might not realize is just how quickly the UFC also took note. Just 2 victories into his UFC career, Dana White and his team called on Israel to step up to the plate and headline the Friday night card on International Fight Week, the predecessor to the massive heavyweight super fight between divisional champion Stipe Miocic and the rising light heavyweight king Daniel Cormier. However, 24 hours before these 2 giants collided, Izzy was tasked with taking on his first ranked test, the veteran Brad Tavares, in a matchup that would tell us quite a lot about where Adesanya was at in his development. At 13-0, Israel's MMA transition had been going quite well, up to that point, with him having scored finishes in all but one of his victories. However, the Tavares test was seen by many as the one that would raise questions about Israel's entire MMA skill set. And sure enough, when fight night came around, those questions were asked and answered emphatically, with Adesanya putting on a 25-minute masterclass, completely outclassing his far more experienced opponent, showcasing his improved grappling and takedown defense in the process. With this win, Izzy would move into the 185-pound top 15, and the rest, as they say, was history. And that will just about do it for this video. But how do you think Israel Adesanya's next defense of his UFC title will play out, as he looks to halt the momentum of the resurgent former champion Robert Whittaker? Do let us know in the comments below. Again, if you enjoyed today's video and want to see more, be sure to leave a like before subscribing to the channel so you can stay up to date with all of our latest uploads. Thanks for watching.